Welcome to what is a historic day. My name is Professor Anthony Reddy and I am the Director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture in Regent's Park College, which is a permanent private hall of the University of Oxford. So today is a historic day because of the subject matter we will be discussing and the significant moment in history in which this event is taking place. Now, to be clear, there have been conferences on whiteness before in the UK. Sociology and cultural studies tend to be about 30 years ahead of Christian theology and the church in engaging with pressing socio-political issues and concerns. In theological terms, Roman Catholics and Presbyterians in the US have explored the issue of whiteness as a problem for Christianity in the church for over 2 decades now. Yet in the UK context for the Christian community, or should I say communities, and for the academics and practitioners and activists who are part of these wider communities, this event is a first. We are embarking on a theological exploration of whiteness. It goes without saying that those of you who self-identify as white are not here because you are, to paraphrase a close Jewish friend of mine, self-hating white people. And whilst I would never speak for anyone else who self-identifies or works with the nomenclature of Black, I am not taking part in this event because I hate or even dislike white people. We are, I hope, here because we are united in our love for justice and our hatred not of people, but of systems, structures, policies and practices that rob individuals and communities of their innate humanity and capacity for transcendence. I want to share a quote from Willie James Jennings in his recent book called After Whiteness, which I suspect may well be repeated throughout the course of the day. That in defining whiteness, Willie James Jennings says this, he says, whiteness does not refer to people of European descent, but to a way of being in the world and seeing the world that forms cognitive and affective structures able to seduce people into its habitation and meaning making. So this day is about looking at practices and structures and systems and ways of being that invariably advantage some people and disadvantage others. The impetus for this day came from 2 of my friends and colleagues, the Reverend Dr. Jill Marsh and the Reverend Dr. Al Barrett, both of whom you will see at various points during the day. And both have in their respective scholarly work and ministry, both have been concerned with exploring how white people can be better allies for Black and Asian peoples and other peoples of colour in Britain. It was at their instigation that the idea for a conference was first mooted. Both Al and Jill are ordained ministers and are not dedicated career academics. It's interesting to note that the bulk of people attending today are practitioners and activists, as opposed to academic theologians. And I think in particular those who are self-identify as systematic theologians or ethicists, although we do have some of you in our midst and we are delighted that you are here. However, it is very clear to us that the thrust for exploring and wrestling with the phenomenon of whiteness is coming from practitioners and activists, and not in the first instance from the theological academy. It will be interesting, and I'm very fascinated to see how the various speakers reflect on their own practice and the significance and the import of whiteness in shaping their attempts to be disciples in the world. We encourage you to engage with this in this day in a constructive process, always respecting the feelings of others. We encourage you to own statements. So if we speak with the I voice in terms of owning what we are saying. and we will encourage us to be generous with each other. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box, and we will do our best to respond to questions and concerns as they arise throughout the day. It's a real pleasure to be sharing in this work with my colleagues and friends, and I trust that we have a constructive and challenging day, which is the first of its kind in this country. It's my pleasure now to hand over to my colleague, the Reverend Dr. Jill Marsh, who will say a few words.
Hello, it's great to be with you, and thank you for coming along. I think we're still having trouble admitting quite a lot of people, so I guess we're going to gather as the morning progresses. So as Anthony said, I'm one of the 3 co-organisers of the conference, and my involvement came when I was asked with Al Barrett to guest edit an issue of Practical Theology, the journal, which will come out early in 2022, and some of the papers from today will end up in that publication, I'm sure. So we're really grateful for that link. It's also great to have with us people from SST as well as from BIAPT, and we welcome David Clough later as one of our respondents. And it's also good to have Anupama Ranawana with us, who is the lead on theology and race for SST. As a white Methodist minister, and as Anthony says, my main focus really is ministerial and practitioner. Like many of the white colleagues here today, I'm sure, I've been changed by my relationships with Black colleagues, family, friends, and church members, enriched by their friendship, shaken by their frighteningly familiar experience of racism and negative stereotyping, challenged by the daily struggle for justice in their lives, and inspired by their consistent faithfulness in the light of much which would, I imagine, put me off church life for good. Yet despite my own Methodist tradition confessing in 1978 that racism is a sin, and contrary to the imperatives of the gospel, I've not seen the change that's needed in church life. And despite my own determination to try and help combat racism, I fear that my best efforts have not been enough. So I know that a more concerted effort to identify, understand, and dismantle the causes of racism, including this concept of whiteness, is vital. In my haste to type an email about this conference, amongst everything else, I mistyped dismantling whiteness as dismantling witness. And I thought that was a really helpful mistake to have made, because I believe that if churches cannot live out Jesus's command to love our neighbours as ourselves, and for that to relate to all our neighbours, then the mission and ministry of the church is negated and at worst destructive in its warped misunderstanding and assumptions of who our neighbours might be. So I'm glad, along with Al and Anthony, that this conference has attracted so much attention. I'm excited that it's filling up. I'm really glad that we can today look together at what the word whiteness might mean and what our experience of whiteness might be, and how we can relate whiteness studies to our theological understanding and practice. It's my real pleasure now to introduce Rachel Starr. Rachel teaches biblical studies, Latin American and feminist theologies at the Queen's Foundation for Ecumenical Theological Education in Birmingham. She's completed her doctorate in Buenos Aires, Argentina, where she was researching the impact of theologies of marriage on critiquing white privilege, on domestic violence. Rachel has also written for the Methodist Church on critiquing white privilege and has worked with student ministers in this area. Rachel, I'm particularly pleased to be the one welcoming you today, as I've been quoting you for 20 years, and we've been inspired by your long-standing commitment to reflexive white theology. Thank you for being here with us, and I hand over to you now for our opening plenary presentation.
Morning, everybody, and thank you very much to Anthony and Al and Jill for setting up this conference and for inviting me to be part of it. I'm going to begin by acknowledging a mistake in that my title that I originally sent round was actually misquoting the passage that I'm going to look at today, which is Mark 7:24 to verse 30, not 29, as I had down previously. So let's begin. Cara Leons Pardew writes, since the earliest days of New Testament interpretation, readers have found themselves in Jesus's encounter with the Canaanite woman. Yet rather than a finding, reading this story from Mark's Gospel while attentive to whiteness has been for me a losing of my place in the text. Where am I in this story of encounter? I suspect I am safely at home, oblivious to the struggle for survival which this text recounts. You see, I've been called a bitch by a strange man when I claimed the space in which we stood was mine also, and I've argued my way through borders crisscrossing the lonely places of Latin America. But my experience is not the same as the woman Jesus meets on the border. White privilege allows me to stay safely in the centre, surrounded by people who look like me. The invitation to cross borders and encounter difference is one I am free to take up or to decline. Reading while white, therefore, must be an exercise in decentering. As I will explore in this paper, white people have been conditioned to associate with the central characters of the gospel story, notably with the figure of Jesus. But as Gina Hens Piazza observes, whether in life or in literature, identification with only the important figures breeds a false understanding of ourselves. Yet to see myself as a minor character must not result in an abdication of responsibility. Wherever I place myself in the text, I need to ask, how do I continue to benefit from white privilege to the detriment of Black and brown people? And if Jesus is here in this text revealed as a borderline racist, a racist at the border, then I should not be too quick to disassociate with him, but rather ask, how do I recognize in this text my own racist speech and actions? What is it about privilege that is so hard to shake? What is it about whiteness that is so hard to see? Like the blank space around the text, whiteness has managed to simultaneously fade into the background, becoming invisible through claims of neutrality and normality, and be the paper on which every story must be written. Peggy McIntosh describes white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I am meant to remain oblivious. That obliviousness is part of my story too. Despite growing up in Enoch Powell's former constituency, the only time I remember being conscious of racism as a teenager was during the protests following the police killing of local man Clinton McCurban, a Black man who was killed in the city centre. It was not until I was at Union Seminary in New York that I began to analyse my own location within the structures of racism. For the first time, I studied with Black and womanist theologians, and as part of a diverse, justice-orientated community, I began to explore what it meant to be white. Since 2000, I've worked with Black and brown colleagues in delivering anti-racism training in several theological institutions. In recent years, more white students arrive familiar with the concept of white privilege and committed to anti-racist work. But little else seems to have changed. As Kalwat Bhopal observes, whiteness and white privilege continues to dominate, with white groups doing everything within their overwhelming power to protect and perpetuate their own positions and status. In Britain today, we know that Black and brown people face multiple disadvantages in every sector of society and culture. As Azariah Frantz Williams and Willie Jennings have recently borne witness, whiteness consumes both church and academy, resulting in the exclusion, marginalization, and silencing of Black and brown people in these spaces, the spaces in which many of us inhabit. I tell my students that while my time in the States was formative, it is in my current context where I have most to learn. It is in the daily interactions and mundane tasks where I am most conscious of my hesitations, assumptions, and failings as a white person. Theologian James Cone called on white theologians to develop an anti-racist theology rooted in action and dialogue. Begin the anti-racist struggle where you are, he advised, and work at a pace as if you were going to do it for the rest of your life. Begin the anti-racist struggle where you are and work at a pace as if you were going to do it for the rest of your life. From where I am, I offer some suggestions for reading the Bible attentive to whiteness, since reading the Bible is a task that those of us who are theologians, ministers, or disciples are daily called to do. As Tatsyong Benny Liu notes, biblical scholarship continues to be dominated by white scholars. Despite the increasing diversity of voices and methods present in the discipline, whiteness remains broadly unexamined. So far, only a handful of biblical scholars have begun to engage with their identity as white readers. In the second edition of our book, the SCM Study Guide to Biblical Hermeneutics, my colleague David Holgate and I offer some suggestions for developing critical white readings of the Bible. First, with the recognition that there are few, if any, white Europeans in the Bible, white readers need to accept that they are not the centre of the story. Second, it is vital to challenge historic and contemporary racist interpretations of the text. Third, white readers need to engage with a diversity of voices within text and interpretation, especially paying attention to those that are often not heard. And finally, it is important to ask how the text might reveal and challenge unearned privilege and unjust power structures. So in the remainder of this paper, I will make use of this basic approach to explore Mark chapter 7, verses 24 to 30. Mark describes an encounter between Jesus and a Syrophoenician woman, in which Jesus initially refuses to heal the woman's daughter, calling her a dog, but is challenged by the woman and proclaims the girl free of the demon which possessed her. The woman and her daughters are minor characters. They are nameless, transient, and much of their identity is hidden behind a stereotype. The story being told is not their story, and in the telling, their well-being is not prioritized. Reading Mark 7 alongside Peggy McIntosh's examples of the impact of unearned white privilege, I note how the woman is marked by her ethnicity, is vulnerable to harassment, is portrayed by later interpreters as needing to be civilized, and is judged also as overly emotional or aggressive in her demands. But the example that stands out most harshly is this one. McIntosh writes, "As a white woman, I can arrange to protect my children most of the time from people who might not like them." What does it mean to call someone a dog? At what cost did the woman gain her daughter's healing? To suggest that Jesus softens his words is dishonest. The woman becomes a dog before us, and whether as a scavenger or pet, Jesus' words here legitimate violence. Jesus' ministry and Mark's gospel telling take place within the context of Roman imperial rule, in which Jews and other colonized people were set against each other, competing for survival. In the passage from Mark, the woman's ethnic identity is underlined. She is culturally Greek and ethnically Syrophoenician. Jesus is identified as a Jew from Galilee. Because Africa has been pushed off the biblical map, we often fail to recognize what Kane Hope Felder describes as Jesus's Afro-Asiatic identity. Indeed, it was only due to my colleague Gifford Ramey that I was reminded of this. In addition, James Cone and others see how the presence of Jesus amongst the oppressed is made visible today in the Black Christ. And as an aside, I note here that Gifford invited me to consider how I might hear Jesus's words if I saw him as a Black man in this passage, a question that I need to reflect on further. Despite his black-brownness, over centuries of European interpretation and iconography, Jesus becomes white. This white Jesus re-enters the text. Against him, both Jewish leaders and Gentile supplicants are othered. As a white reader, I am invited to identify with Jesus and therefore find myself set against the others. As a white reader, how I justify Jesus' treatment of the Syrophoenician woman is illustrative of how I justify my own racism. A number of strategies have been employed by Western readers in their attempts to permit or praise Jesus' behaviour. A common reading is the suggestion that by engaging with a Gentile woman, Jesus broke with Jewish exclusivism. Such reading set up a binary opposition between Christianity and not only Judaism, but any other faith or cultural tradition, as well as being profoundly untrue of Judaism. The woman is understood to repent of her pagan ways and come to faith. The savage beast civilized, the text becomes a problematic account of Western colonization and mission activity. And as Moussa Dubé observes, the story portrays Jesus entering an inhabited land and requiring its occupants to fall down and abase themselves before him before agreeing to save them. A second approach has been to describe the encounter as playful. In this reading, a reading that you often hear in sermons, the woman gives as good as she gets, recognizing Jesus' words as harmless banter. She is a feisty and worthy opponent who impresses Jesus. Yet such an interpretation willfully ignores the unequal power dynamics of the encounter. It suggests Black and brown people, women and queer folk can also be one of the boys, as long as they can take a joke. A further reading begins with the recognition that Jesus messed up, but quickly moves to praise Jesus for being willing to learn from the woman. Here the problem is the moralizing of the encounter, again with no awareness of the power dynamics. The burden for educating Jesus falls on the Syrophoenician woman. In summary, white Western interpretations of this passage have legitimated Christian colonialism, framed Jesus as the white saviour of ethnically othered villains or victims, and subtly suggested it is the responsibility of Black and brown people to laugh off racism and to educate white people. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." How do I hear Jesus' words reading it from my hometown of Wolverhampton, where the framing of Black and brown people as dogs is a historic, social and cultural reality? The historian David Olusoga describes how during the 17th and 18th century, collars were placed around the necks of both dogs and enslaved Africans in Britain, indicating a desire to discipline and control. And local Black historian Patrick Vernon points us to records of the manufacture of such collars in Wolverhampton. In addition, Black young boys were purchased as domestic servants or pets for white wealthy women. The Molyneux family, whose name is intertwined with the city of Wolverhampton, brought a 3-year-old child who they named George Africanus, and his baptism is recorded in the city centre church of St. Peter's. More recently, while there is some debate over the extent of signs reading "No Blacks, No Dogs, No Irish," during the 1950s and 60s, Black and Asian people were frequently denied entrance to shops, pubs and accommodation, notably in the West Midlands. Indeed, the Black activist Malcolm X visited Smethwick, just down the road from Wolverhampton, in 1965 in support of activists fighting attempts to exclude Black people from housing and public spaces in the area. White people have called Black and brown people dogs in an attempt to dehumanize, humiliate and exclude. And this is the context from which I read Jesus's words, and which demands my repentance and resistance. So, to conclude, some suggestions for developing a critical white reading of this and other biblical texts. First, do not ignore or attempt to justify the violence present in the text and our reading context. In his book Ghost Ship, Azariah Frantz Williams notes white people's failure to understand the subtle nuances of racism that we are subjected to on a daily basis. As a white reader, I need to pay better attention. Second, do not seek to escape your whiteness. In this passage, I am not the victim. The temptation is for me to place myself in the narrative alongside the Syrophoenician woman, to fail to acknowledge the racialized power dynamics of text and interpretation. As such, Paul Cavell challenges white people's attempts to claim some other identity which will give us legitimate victim status. Third, decenter yourself. Neither am I the white saviour in this text, and neither, for that matter, is Jesus. To note again a comment from my colleague Gifford Ramey, what space do I need to clear in order for Blackness to perform without impunity? Finally, seek out possibilities for healing and solidarity. Learn deeply, joyfully from the work and witness of scholars and activists who are different to you, who speak from the borderlands and even from under the table. In her reading of Mark's story, African-Brazilian scholar Silvia Regina de Lima argues that the saving word comes not from Jesus, but from the Syrophoenician woman. It is she who heals her daughter, claiming her daughter's right to live. Regina de Lima sees in the Syrophoenician woman her own ancestors and abuelas, Black women whose under-the-table African faith practices have enabled them to survive, despite the racism and sexism they encounter. How then, in our readings and in our everyday practices, might we too meet God under the table, sharing the crumbs of a subversive faith which sustains in us the saving work of justice?
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was clear and really helpful and really, really challenging. So thank you very much. I'm just trying to check. I think what we need people to do is to send their questions to me, actually. So I'm going to start with one from Angela, who asks this. If we want to dismantle a white Jesus as Western Christians, does that involve letting go of our certainties about who he is and what he came to do? I think you did answer that a bit by implication, but if you could say a bit more about that, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I was reading in my preparation for this for today the work of I think a scholar called Karen Teal, who was talking about how one of the kind of identifying features of white theology is that that desire for logic, kind of conclusions and everything neatly wrapped up, and kind of I suppose a kind of confidence. And she was saying that that was problematic in itself. So I think, coming back to that question, Jill, that sense of being willing to actually see Jesus in a more messy way, see more questions that we have in terms of how Jesus is and what our relationship with Jesus might be, is important. Does that answer the question okay?
I'd need Angela to tell us that or not, but it was certainly helpful to me. Anyway, I wanted to ask you personally about preaching. I don't actually know if you're a preacher or not, but I'm very struck by the often gap between what preachers and ministers learn in training and then what actually happens from pulpits in the old days or from a Zoom microphone nowadays. I just wondered if you had anything you could help us with about that, really. How do we get this into our practice in worship and in understanding the Bible in church context?
I don't preach very much, only occasionally. And I wonder whether part of that is, again, a kind of a little bit of a hesitancy around how preaching has often developed as a tradition where people have a point to say and they kind of drive it home very kind of clearly. I mean, hopefully, I think there's been a kind of slightly stepping away from that kind of teaching method of preaching into a kind of a more invitational model. I think, as with anything, it's about making those connections. So being willing to bring your reading, your experience, your reflections into your teaching. And one of the things that I always encourage students to do is to make sure they're engaging with commentaries from different scholars from around the world. So not simply reading, one or two commentaries that reflect back to them a kind of white Western perspective, but intentionally seeking out commentaries written by scholars from all over the world, because that in itself provokes different questions. And similarly, to engage with Jewish scholarship is so significant, because again, that will provoke those questions and encourage you to lose that confidence that you have about what the text means.
Thank you very much. And Justine has added a question which I think follows on from this a little bit, which was, do you have any particular other texts which you would recommend for us to wrestle with in relation to challenging our views of Jesus? I know that's a bit like being in a pub quiz as a vicar and then you're thinking, oh, I need to know the answers. But are there particular texts that you would suggest working with in particular?
I think I would say trust your instincts. I think often when we read texts, we're encouraged by both the narrator and the kind of dominant way of interpreting the text to push away those questions or those hesitations we have. And I think that occurs, I mean, I always feel really stressed about the wedding at Cana and how Jesus kind of interacts with his mother there. There are a number of moments where I kind of think, oh, I don't like that very much. That's just one example that comes to the top of my head. But I think it's about, as Gina Hens Piazza says, whose work I come back to a lot, really naming the violence that is there, even if it seems to be coming from the characters that we assume are in the right, and being willing to say, what is harmful here? What is harsh here? What do we need to kind of wrestle with? Because otherwise, if we justify the interactions that are difficult or problematic or unequal within the text, we just perpetuate that when we do that in our own lives and experience.
Okay. Rachel, there are so many questions coming in here that I'm not sure what to do with them all. And I'm aware that we need to give Paul some time as well.
Absolutely.
Somebody in particular asked whether we could, whether you could let us have, I guess through the text, maybe via me, the name of the Brazilian theologian that you referred to. So if you could just send that to us, that would be really helpful, because somebody,
yeah, I can do that. Yeah, thank you.
A lot of the questions actually are around Jewish identity and the way the Bible deals with Judaism and how that relates to Jesus being black in some sense. And I think that's such a really helpful but massive topic that we won't start
definitely.
that now. But I guess, again, if there's anything you wanted to refer us to, that would be really helpful. So I know that I'm a bit frazzled today with all that's been going on Zoom, and I absolutely know I'm going to watch and re-watch the recording. And just to say to everybody, we are going to make the recordings of the plenary sessions available so that you can watch them again and share them as appropriate with other people. So thank you,
Jill.
Looking forward to having you with us for the rest of the day. And I'm sure you'll have some more to help us with later on. So thank you so much. And now I'm going to hand over to Anthony, who's going to introduce Paul.
It's my genuine pleasure to introduce Professor Paul Weller. Paul Weller is a research fellow in religion and society at Regent's Park College in the University of Oxford, where he's also the associate, pardon me, he's also the associate director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture. He's a part-time professor in Coventry University's Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, and he is an emeritus professor of the University of Derby. He first became involved in anti-racist work in the late 1970s while working as a Baptist minister in Tameside in Greater Manchester. In the mid-80s, he was a community relations officer for the Greater Manchester County Ecumenical Council with responsibility for racial justice and interfaith relations. And he's particularly active in anti-deportation, family reunification sanctuary campaigns. On a personal level, Paul is a friend and a colleague at Regents. And when I started in the job as a director of the Centre for Oxford, for the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture in January last year, I relied a great deal on Paul's wisdom. Paul is an alumni of Regent's Park College, and he has been therefore my sure-footed guide in helping me to understand all the strange ways of Oxford University. And so oftentimes when I was deciding to do either A, B, or C, I would check with Paul and say, Paul, so you've been around for a long time. What do you think? Is this a dumb idea or will it fly? And Paul has been fantastic. So Paul Weller, we are in your hands, and please share with us.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Anthony, for that very generous welcome, and thank you to the organisers overall for the opportunity to speak to this event and engage in discussion with all of you involved in it. The title of my paper is The Problems of the White Ethnic Majority Revisited, a Personal, Theological and Political Review. Like most things in life, getting older is pregnant with ambiguity. On the one hand, the passage of the years can bring with it the possibility of perspective on what to younger people might, for good and ill, seem to be an exceptionalist particularity of the present. But on the other hand, if one is not careful, getting older can also engender a certain weariness out of the sense that things do not seem to progress very much, or at least if they do, that they have also a tendency to loop back again onto themselves. During this last summer, I found myself talking with my now 20-something-year-old white, albeit British German offspring, a side comment to which I'll come back to later in this paper, about the Black Lives Matter uprisings. And in talking with them about it, I was challenged to return to and to look again at something that I'd written 35 years ago in a little booklet under the title of The Problems of the White Ethnic Majority, published then by Christians Against Racism and Fascism and One for Christian Renewal, and the title of which was a deliberate inversion of what was the language of the time, often talked about as the problems of ethnic minorities. To some extent, this paper on the problems of the white ethnic majority revisited is the product of those conversations with my adult children this last summer. And I'm doing this because I wanted to interrogate myself about how far, as a white Christian individual, in the wider Christian tradition to which I belong, and of the ethnic majority of the UK of which I'm a part, have I or we changed or not changed, and if so, in what ways, since I first wrote The Problems of the White Ethnic Majority in 1984. Well, just as many white people during this past year have been brought up sharp by the challenges around the I can't breathe death of George Floyd and its embodiment of many aspects of the Black Lives Matter movement. Around 3.5 decades ago now, as a young white Baptist minister with very little direct personal experience of the multiracial and multicultural society that the UK had become while I was growing up as a teenager in Margate in Kent, I was brought up sharp by the impact in 1981 of the New Cross massacre fire, in which 13 young Black people died and which many believe to have been the work of fascists. In the wake of that, there was a dramatic march of thousands of Black people in London in protest about what had happened and the police indifference to those 13 young Black lives. And in connection with that march, I encountered, or perhaps better to say, I was encountered by a searing piece of writing by Ambavalana Shivanandan called White Man, Listen. In some ways, if I'm honest, I wondered if I should not perhaps use the time I have today simply to read that challenge in its entirety, because the things of which it spoke then could, all too depressingly, still equally forcefully and relevantly speak into the UK of today without need of much further commentary, if any at all. But to do so would, I think, have let me and other white people among us in this conference off the hook of our own responsibilities to make at least some attempt to tackle the problems of the white ethnic majority. But I am going to share some of it, as also in a few minutes of another powerful piece written in the 1980s, which also had an effect on me. Because learning to listen, while not sufficient, if it ends there, is an absolutely necessary starting point in attempting the task of dismantling whiteness, and even more so if it should be possible to attempt the construction of a critical white theology. So Shivanandan said, with what I think is clear are also strong contemporary resonances, quotes, "Listen, white man. Listen to what Black people are saying to you. Listen now before it's too late. Listen for the sake of your own decency, the salvation of your own society." That march, that Monday, that march of the Black 10,000, to the best of you, it spoke of Black frustration, white insensitivity to Black problems, the breakdown in police-Black relations. To the rest of you, it spoke of mob violence, Blacks on the rampage, the invasion of your privacy, the damage to your property. But it is not to these or the yellow press that I address myself. You mistake the mood. The mood is not of the moment, of momentary outrage at the burning of our children in a fire in Deptford. Shivanandan's challenge of white man listen then went into a long and painful litany of why the UK more generally, and especially white people within it, such as myself and many of you in this conference today, should really not need what happened to George Floyd in the USA in order to face up to and come to terms with the profoundly and deeply rooted history of racism and injustice towards Black people in the UK, and the seeming all too readiness of many of us who are white to live with it. But in honesty, apart perhaps from some of us who are white and are of my kind of age, I doubt whether many of the following names invoked in Shivanandan's litany are known by many white people today. Rather, they've likely shared the fate of those many Black people who, in contrast to the many memorials to slave owners, colonialists, and imperialists, mostly have no public memory, forgotten and invisible to most white people. Rather, they were usually never known and were often nearly always invisible to white people. But of these, at least Shivanandan says, do you remember the murder of Gurdeep Singh Chagga, of Kenneth Singh, Michael Ferreira, Altab Ali, and so many more, all on the high streets of your cities? Black people do. for that is all their memory, their history in this country. They remember Oluwale, the tramp hounded to death by your friendly bobbies, George Lindo railroaded to prison, Steve Thompson committed to Rampton for daring to be a Rasta and different, Errol Madden arrested for being in possession of his own property. They remember the virginity tests, the deportations, the stop and search and the sudden arrests, the blanket raids of the illegal immigration unit into homes and workplaces, the thuggery of the Special Patrol Group, and the unexplained deaths in custody. This tendency to white forgetfulness is why over 3.5 decades ago, I began the problems of the white ethnic majority with the words of the Hebrew prophet Isaiah, reprised by Jesus as recorded in the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 13, verses 14 to 15. He said, "You will listen and listen again, but not understand. See and see again, but not perceive. For the heart of this nation has grown coarse. Their ears are dull of hearing, and they have shut their eyes, for fear that they would see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and be converted and healed by me." At the end of his piece on White Man Listen, Shivanandan went on forensically to pick apart the nature of so many white responses at that time to the New Cross massacre and Black March against it, before eventually coming to a sobering conclusion, a conclusion which I think even if those who are white among us only half listen to now, we will very soon recognize how sadly it is there in the political and media commentariat discussions around Black Lives Matter today. Quotes, "And you fell back on old ploys, old themes, the two sides of the question approach, the numbers game, the fertility count, the legitimate fears of the British public, the threat to the British way of life. You have come full circle. This is where you first began, pandering to prejudice, sanctioning fears, legitimating racism, and in creating the moral morass that fascism breeds in, creating the monsters of your own destruction. Listen, white man, for it is of your destruction and ours that I speak." So why is it that, especially to those of us who are getting older, but also for those who take the time and trouble to look into it, if it's not present through their direct experience as Black people, the history of these things so often seems to be on loop? Before he became known for other controversies in the 1980s, Salman Rushdie also wrote a powerful piece called "The New Empire Within Britain," the title of which is, I think, the clue to this. And in it, Rushdie issued the challenge to white people. Quotes, "You talk about the race problem, immigration problem, all sorts of problems. If you are a liberal,
Yes.
you say that Black people have problems.
Oh, it's cold.
If you are not, you say that they are the problem. But the members of the new colony have only one real problem. That problem is white people. Racism, of course, is not our problem. It is yours. We simply suffer the effects of your problem. And until you, the whites, see that the issue isn't integration or harmony or multiculturalism or immigration, but simply the business of facing up to and eradicating the prejudices within almost all of you, then the citizens of your new and last empire will be obliged to struggle against you." In many ways, if this is taken completely seriously, it is a very stark, especially in its concluding sentence about what would be the case if those of us who are not white do not engage seriously in the business of facing up to our prejudices. Namely, that the citizens of your new and last empire will be obliged to struggle against you. At that time, when I wrote The Problems of the White Ethnic Majority, I wrote, quotes, Salman Rushdie is exactly, if uncomfortably, right. The business of those of us who are white then is not so much to try to solve the problems of Black people as to tackle our problems as they affect Black people. This is not to claim a priority for our problems, but it is to recognize that in a society where the majority are white, the liberation of both Black and white people demands that white people, as well as Black people, work towards the liberation of all. Part of the reason why I came at that time to believe that Salman Rushdie was exactly, if uncomfortably right, emerged precisely out of my experience as a young white Christian leader. And I'd emphasize not as one who was sitting on the sidelines, but perhaps even more challengingly, as one who was trying to be engaged in the attempt to take racism seriously and to engage with it. Therefore, the preface to my publication those years ago began with the following self-critical learning that I think is only to be had by the active engagement of a white Christian person trying to do something to combat racism. Quotes, as a white community relations officer working for and mainly within the Christian churches, I often find myself put in the highly invidious position of being called upon to interpret Black experience to white Christians. I know that this is really an impossible task to do properly, since my white experience is different from the Black experience of Britain. And I suspect that sometimes I'm only being used as a buffer to avoid the challenges of the Black communities themselves. Because of this, I've increasingly come to believe that it is crucial for me and for other white people to reflect specifically and carefully on the problems of the white ethnic majority, instead of accepting the role of interpreter of Black experience. This pamphlet is written out of the concern that white Christian reflection on our multiracial society all too easily slips into the trap of a distorted Good Samaritan syndrome, of focusing on what white Christians in the churches can do to help with the problems of the Black ethnic minorities, when we ought to be wrestling with our own problems as members of the white ethnic majority. So today, the fact that 35 years on, there is a conference with around 300 participants and more on the challenge of dismantling whiteness and constructing a critical white theology is one that brings hope to an increasingly older person such as myself. The presence of Black people in British society has challenged the complacency of those of us in the white ethnic majority about our all too often assumed decency, fairness, and democracy. This has especially been true when Black people show they are not ready to accept white put-downs, but are determined to stand up for human rights and to resist the humanization of racism. Of course, when this happens, the truth is that many of us who are white, even or perhaps precisely when we are ourselves trying to do something to address racism, begin to feel threatened. But here we come back to the words of the prophet Isaiah and of Jesus, that if we truly listen to God's voice of judgment speaking to us through Black people, that voice of judgment can also be a voice of grace. And the problems of the white ethnic majority in which we share can become transformed into liberative opportunities. But for this to happen, those of us who are white really do need to engage with white history and to understand, in the words also of Shivanandan that cut both ways, our history is not your history. A key factor in this matter of Black and white histories is that, generally speaking, Black people are more conscious of their history and significance than are many white people of theirs or ours. It is this white unconsciousness of history which makes many of us think that we can relate together with Black people in society or in the church as if we lived in some kind of social or historical vacuum. As Tuku Mukherjee said in a British Council of Churches film strip of the 1980s called The Enemy Within, there is no escaping this fact that by and large, if you are white, you are brought up in a racist cultural atmosphere. You take it on. In other words, none of us who are white in Britain today has escaped the scars of that cultural and historical inheritance. The truly visceral level at which this can operate is something I can testify to from my own experience as a child, from a time before I was really capable of making my own judgments and decisions and commitments. In recounting this, I still feel very uncomfortable, but it reflects part of the truth of what is the case for many of us who are white people, part of the problems of the white ethnic majority. So I continue with the story. In the mid-1960s, my paternal grandparents lived in Brixton, South London, which was one of the early main areas of settlement of people from the Caribbean. And as a family, we used to go and visit them. My grandparents lived in a block of flats where they shared the landing with another family. That family was Black. And as I recall it, my grandparents and the Black family shared the toilet on the landing. And to this day, I can remember being afraid to use that toilet. Why? It was not, I think, from my parents, but somehow or other, perhaps from TV or the books I was beginning to read or my friends or somehow from the environment in which I was living in, was growing up, the idea of associating Black people with disease and uncleanness had got into my mind. This could not have been the result of a conscious decision about Black people. It was a result of, as Tuku Mukherjee had put it, the racist atmosphere in which I was growing up. Now, telling this story should most definitely not be misunderstood as an argument that these matters operate only or primarily at the level of personal prejudices. It is precisely, though, from such and countless other experiences of micro-personal prejudices that the bigger question should be posed concerning how such attitudes connect into the structural history and inheritance of the wider society. As members of the white ethnic majority, our history is one that has been deeply rooted in imperialism and colonialism, and all that signified by those words, which are not tired and now empty slogans of a passé communism, but they represent very substantive realities that have shaped and continue to shape the experience of the world. These problems of those of us in the white ethnic majority are very deeply ingrained and may even run counter to our present personal choices and commitments. But the hold that this history has over us needs to be recognized if we are to hope for liberation. Indeed, the very recognition of that inheritance in itself can be the beginning of overcoming it. The recognition doesn't make the problem go away, but it does get a lever on it. And as the great anti-racist minister of the period, Methodist minister of that period, Tony Holden, put it in his Zebra Project pamphlet from 1980 called Black Consciousness and White Liberation, quotes, "There is a sense in which we are inevitably racist in Britain because we are an ex-colonial power. And while this knowledge does not take away our responsibility, maybe it can free us from our guilt so that we can face up to, rather than play down, what has been going on in our society during these past 30 years or so." That was 1980. He means now 70 years or so, and indeed centuries behind that. As Holden pointed out, personal guilt feelings are a common problem lying in wait for members of the white ethnic majority who are becoming aware of our problems, and they can be singularly unproductive and even counterproductive. However, their tendency to paralyzing effect can be overcome when we realize the role played by structures and forces that are beyond our immediate personal control, not to let us off the hook of challenging them, but as a realistic appraisal of the situation in many of us find ourselves in, and as a call to challenge those things in the wider societies in which we live. If we recognize these things, the issue is, what do we do about them? Do we pretend and continue to sin, or do we repent and struggle against this? Will we ever really leave our white ethnic majority problems behind us? Can we contribute anything to the struggle of a just and harmonious society? When we've recognized Black history as Black people tell it, when we've taken our problems seriously, when we've recognized that in doing this, we are going to experience conflict and pain, do things become clearer? Well, it's important in the end to develop an honesty with ourselves and a commitment to solidarity. And in that, Shivanandam's dictum remains underlined for us. Black history is not white history. That basic gap is still there, even in the affirmation and working towards common and equal humanity. When I first wrote The Problems of the White Ethnic Majority, as a white Christian increasingly becoming conscious of these problems, I wrote something by which I've more recently come to address myself with, in all honesty and seriousness, than I perhaps did at the time. And it's this, quotes, "We know that however much we are committed to solidarity with Black people, we are not Black. We can do nothing about this. It is a fact of social position. But we do need to recognize that it means we can always walk away from the experience of solidarity. We may get involved with the risks of solidarity and even pay some of the costs. But in the final analysis, we can walk away. And in truth, I am today personally not engaged in the degree of anti-racist activism that I was 30 or 40 years ago. I hope that in both the academic and practical work concerned with relations between people of different faiths that I've since become more engaged with, and through which I've tried to confront in myself and in others the discrimination and othering that dehumanizes both those who suffer from it and those who perpetrate it, that there is some continuity. But I do have to ask questions of myself of what it means in relation to racism, that those of us who are white may get involved with the risks of solidarity and even pay some of the costs, but that in the final analysis, the truth is we can walk away, which is not something that is possible for those who are Black. And that's the rub for me, if I'm brutally honest. And in concluding, perhaps a clue about how to face and handle such uncomfortable truth can be found in a very powerful 1976 pamphlet from the British Council of Churches Community and Race Relations Unit called The New Black Presence in Britain, which when it was first published had an electrifying effect. In it, Gus John wrote something that in its appeal to self-interest might seem counterintuitive to many of the at first sight apparently, in its stark unexpectedness, bears reflecting upon carefully for those of us who in one way or another hope with help from our friends to be able to continue in some measure to try to overcome in ourselves and to tackle in the wider society the problems of the white ethnic majority. Gus John, and I finish with these words, said, "A preoccupation with community relations and racial harmony is unjustified and misplaced, unless it is seen as a natural outcome of the struggle for equality, liberation, human dignity, and racial justice. The Church must choose to identify with and wage that struggle, not in order that Blacks might be given a better deal, but on its own terms and out of active self-interest. If the Church is happy about the society which Black people experience in the manner described, then it has nothing to say to Black people, or to whites for that matter, and it deserves to be condemned with the oppressive system. If it is not, then it is imperative that it engages the values of society and works towards a reordering of society in accordance with the vision of social justice and the deliverance of the oppressed, which as church, it must have in Christ. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And thank you for the unflinching honesty with which you speak, actually sort of drawing upon your own personal experience. We have a number of questions in the chat box. I've got some questions for you as well, but I will save those for another time because obviously we meet on a regular basis and hopefully at some point we'll be back in the senior common room in Regent's Park College and we can ask those questions over a glass of nice red wine. So swiftly moving on, and apologies to those questions that don't get asked because we clearly just don't have enough time. But Paul, a question for you from Angela. She says, does a repentance of the sin of racism in UK churches involve actively challenging British nationalism?
Short answer, yes. Longer answer, read Anthony's book about theologizing Brexit. And I think that for me explains why it's necessary. And that challenge, incidentally, also has applicability not only to the white ethnic majority, but in some parts also to Black people, some Black people within our churches. And Anthony makes that clear in his book also. So yes, I think it does. And I think part of the wrestling with this, and I didn't really come onto that, I said as a footnote, I might return to it, you know, my children are British German. We have within our society, having left the European Union, a big issue coming up after the 30th of June, when overnight, possibly, many hundreds or thousands of people will become illegal in this country if they don't have settled or pre-settled status. They may share then the same experience as the Windrush generation, or 20 years on, their children or grandchildren may share that experience. Are they white? Are they Black? What does that mean in this context? It's a big question, but it is wrapped up, I think, with British nationalism, which itself is rooted in, I would argue, I wrote a piece on Brexit called Brexit, a Colonial Boomerang, which started out internally inside these islands before it was then exported into the wider world. And until we really get to grips with and wrestle with that question, we won't be able to deconstruct that either.
Thank you. Okay, so we have another question from Stephen, who says, so could you please share and vision what whiteness today without privilege, racism, supremacy might look like?
Sharing what it might look like, I might be able to do. The fact is, certainly in Britain, I don't think whiteness today is able yet to be in that position. So it remains, I think, the nature of a vision as distinct from something that can clearly be painted right now. I think it certainly one of the things it means is coming to terms with, and this is within the church in particular, I'll address at this point what the church is, the reality and the importance of Black leadership being exercised within the Christian churches, in terms of where so much vibrancy and so much growth, so much engagement in our church lives actually exist, but still the barriers towards that leadership, and it's in facilitating and supporting and encouraging and sometimes defending that leadership that I think one can start to see the role in which positively we can experience whiteness in a different kind of way. That is to say, alongside each other as brothers and sisters properly, not just as a cheap grace kind of use of words.
Okay, I think we got time for one more question before we go to our break. So this question's from Johnson. It says, how do we follow Jesus when our very relationship to him is haunted by the history of racism? And that's a supplementary question. He says, and was Jesus a racist?
Okay, the first question, first of all, I think I would want to approach by commenting that actually Jesus was not a Christian, which is something I think that Christians all too often forget and try to appropriate Jesus as a Christian. Jesus was not a Christian. Jesus was a Jew, but Jesus was not a Christian. So in that sense, and in the proper sense of the word otherness, the otherness of Jesus, I think is something that we all in institutional church terms have to come to terms with, because we do not own Jesus. Though the temptation is to make him into something that we own. And that lack of ownership, I think, is something that our first speaker was trying to also point to and articulate through her exploration of some of the New Testament texts. And perhaps also something about your question, your second question, was Jesus a racist, might also have something in what our first speaker was trying to say in that story of the Canaanite woman.
Thank you very much. We'll stop it there at the moment. There are lots of questions in the chat box. We're now going to take a 10-minute break. We will come back at approximately 12 noon. And at that point, there will be a panel that will consist of our two speakers and myself and Al Barrett and Jill Marsh. And hopefully we will be able to take some of the additional questions that have not been asked thus far in the chat box to both speakers. There are certainly, it seems to me, a number of questions that are, I think, addressing issues of Jesus' Jewishness and anti-Semitism and the otherness of Jesus, which obviously Paul has just spoken of, and Rachel also commented on in her paper. Also, when we get back, you will have an opportunity to put additional questions into the box. And one of the questions we'd perhaps like you to reflect on is this: what insight have you gained from what you have heard this morning? What insight have you gained from what you have heard this morning? So thank you very much to both our speakers. You both did exactly what we hoped you would do when we invite you to come and speak. And we think that you have set our conference off with a fantastic framing of the issues that challenges all of us. So we'll come back at 12 noon. So please feel free to go away, have a cup of coffee. You don't necessarily need to log out and come back in again. Probably just switch off your camera and mute it. And then have a break, and we'll see you in again in about 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Okay, folks, I trust that you've all had a good break. What we are going to do now is that we're going to have a panel conversation. So myself and Rachel and Paul and Al and Jill will hopefully be able to respond to some of your questions and queries that have been raised both in the chat box. If you have a question, please write it in bold in the chat box, and we'll do our best between now and past to kind of push this conversation on. I think I'd like to start by putting a question, I think, probably towards Rachel, who's a biblical scholar amongst us, but I think anyone else can chip in. I know many of us who have grown up in church will revere Jesus as being this very holy person, obviously beyond any imperfection, who's without sin. Therefore, I was wondering, Rachel, whether you could kind of just unpack this sense of Jesus being a racist, because I'm sure that is probably a matter of concern for a number of people, because, you know, I mean, how can the Son of God be a racist? So.
Yeah, I think, Anthony, that was something I really experienced in myself as I was typing. I typed and then I put things in bracket, like I was thinking, I don't know if I can say this because there is something kind of visceral about not wanting to name that. My first point of reference, as almost with everything, is Yvonne Guevara, the Brazilian eco-feminist, who kind of talks about messiness and, you know, God is in the mess. So Jesus is human, Jesus is in the mess, God is in the mess. She also talks about how all things are kind of held in God. So she's kind of saying, get over it. Don't try and make anything out to be perfect. Just get over with the reality of what you're facing. So I hear Yvonne Guevara's kind of encouragement to get over our kind of obsession with perfection, I suppose, and recognize the reality and complexity of everyday life, of which Jesus, you know, was a part in his time as a human. But yeah, I think, and I think it's that kind of, I think on the other hand, what I really kind of feel strongly about is how we are taught to not see things that are wrong. And, you know, that's something when we think about safeguarding issues within the church, we think about the way that we don't connect up our theology to our practices. You know, thinking about my own work around domestic violence and theologies of marriage, we fail to make the connections. And again, it's just about naming it. Obviously, I recognize there's a tension there. I want to hold up Jesus as you know, I want to hold up Jesus in all that he offers me, and all that I gain from how I engage with Jesus. But I don't want that desire to see him in that way to prevent me from naming things that I feel uncomfortable about. Because if I do that for Jesus, I will do that for everybody. And I think that's the kind of key point, really.
Okay.
I wondered if I could join in with this question as well, because I think for me it's something about Jesus as human. If he's fully human, then he was limited in his experience, and I think there's something for all of. I get very worried when anybody says I'm not racist, because I think I have understood, you know, that we're all racist actually, whatever skin color we have, whatever background we have sort of racist. We have a tendency to prejudice and to sort of acting on those prejudices without examining them. So, for example, when Prince William said that, you know, my family is not racist, I wish he'd said, actually, my family is racist as we all are. I think that would be more helpful. So I think there is some question here about the word racism and what it means today. And that's why, yeah, it's a good question.
And I think if I could just chip in as well, I think one of the errors that particularly us white people often fall into is individualizing this, as Jill, I think you were pointing us to. And actually, whatever doctrine we hold around Jesus, we're talking about the air he breathed, aren't we? Just as we're talking about racism being in the air that we breathe. And as I read the Syrophoenician woman story, I'd like to think that if Jesus's mother was present and heard him say what he said, she would have given him a clip round the ear, in a sense that wasn't how she brought him up, but nevertheless, actually what he was doing was repeating language that was used, and so he was participating in the atmosphere that used language about Gentiles in that sense. So I think it is a shock to hear those words come from Jesus' mouth, but I think it's an invitation both to see what happens in that encounter and the challenge that the Syrophoenician woman presents back to him, but also a challenge to investigate more widely the atmosphere that Jesus is walking in.
Paul, do you have any reflections?
Just a small side comment to some of that. I think perhaps that if one is to invoke the concept of sin in relation to sins. And sin is a structural thing in which we're all caught up. It manifests itself in sins. Very often we have the tendency, all of us, I think, to focus on the individual instances and not on the structural thing that lies behind it. And yet, actually, in the New Testament writings, what it is that is both being challenged and where we're offered the possibility of deliverance is focused on sin first, I think, I would argue. And that maybe has some relevance to this discussion.
Yeah. I think for myself, just very, very quickly, I think what I've always taken from this text is not just the issue around the racism, but also Jesus' patriarchy. And certainly as someone who is a privileged male leader, what I've often said to different groups when I've looked at this text is how different the world would be if certainly male leaders with authority had the strength of character and humility to acknowledge that we were wrong and change our minds, because that's what Jesus does. That actually, how oftentimes when we're challenged, what we do, we fall back on either sort of dismissing the challenge, so we throw it back at the person who is, particularly it's a woman, and we ridicule them for the challenge, or we then fall into a process of sort of self-justification by saying something like, well, I'm sorry, but like, you don't understand, I was trying to do this, rather than saying, actually, I was just wrong. I'm sorry, I'm wrong, messed up. I think differently. How different that would be. I mean, that's not a panacea for all ills, but let's be honest with you, we have a prime minister who was pulled up for making racist comments and still hasn't apologized for them. Still hasn't apologized, like for calling Muslim women letterboxes. Still hasn't apologized for comparing black people as jungle bunnies with watermelon smiles. Still hasn't said, he just dismisses it. So actually, what we've been modeled at the moment is the epitome of white privilege and exceptionalism and entitlement. So Jesus' actions, I think, are very human, but they also give us a sense of how to be different. Let's move on to other questions, and we have, there are 22 questions in the box, but let me just kind of take this one, because I think it sums up, I think, maybe quite a few questions around Jewishness and supersessionism. And I think it comes from Julie Gittos, who says, the question that keeps pinging around in my mind, especially being located in North London with my many friends and colleagues and neighbours from the Jewish community. So I have to scroll down, and I scroll down. I lost the rest of the question. I apologise for this. Okay, let me go back again. Oh, good heavens. Okay. Oh, sorry about this. Okay, so let's try and find the rest of Julie's question. Yeah, it was something about sort of supersessionism and how do we deal with the way in which we have pretty much excluded, I guess, like Jesus' Jewishness, and we speak as Gentiles as if Jesus is one of us. Perhaps if someone could kind of respond to that. I mean, I apologize to Julie if I've lost the real nuance of the question.
I put the question in the chat box, just at the end.
Yeah.
Can I read it? Would that be helpful?
Yeah,
Please,
The question that keeps pinging around my mind, especially being located in North London with many friends, colleagues, neighbours from the Jewish community, is this: how do we face the impact of supersessionism, acknowledging our white/Gentile otherness in such a way that helps us in relation to race and anti-Semitism?
I think with this text, there are so many different ways into it, and there's so many different ways in which the power kind of works out. So we look at the text in its original context, the Markan community, we look at it in Jesus' time. So where the power dynamic is just shifts so dramatically depending on the time that it's set in, the time that it's read in, and then later interpretations, and then how we respond to later interpretations. So although normally I would be wanting to say really clearly to students and colleagues and to myself, we need to see Jesus as a marginalized person, as a Jew, as someone who is under Roman rule. We need to recognize that he is other to us, that he is not us, that we have to recognize his critique and challenge to us, those of us who identify as white. But then, because of the fact that in this text we have to also acknowledge how we have made Jesus white, and to not then use saying, well, Jesus is a Jew, so we have to hear his critique, to step away from how we often, we justify racist language. And as I was kind of saying in my paper, the people who have been talked about as dogs are not white people. That's the reality. So the impact of this text, the impact of Jesus in this text, has been against Black and brown people. And therefore, if we are too quick to say, well, we need to remember that Jesus is a marginalized Jew in this text, I think what we're doing is trying to let ourselves off the hook. If that gets, but I think, it's every time we look at it, there's new things for us to learn. Every way that we set up this dynamic, we can enter and exit at different places and see new things to learn.
Thank you. Is there anyone else on the panel who would like to respond to that?
I mean, I think this whole tension, and somebody put a question earlier or comments in the chat about incarnational theology, and I think this sort of touches upon that in relation to the relationship between what I might call the particularities and the humanities in the incarnation. Because I remember also a long time ago, in the 70s, there used to be often quite challenging TV programs of plays, Dennis Potter, Son of Man, things like that. And I remember watching one that as a young man made a very big impact on me, with a nun who at the end of her life died and was having the last rites read to her. And she said, "What's Jesus got to do with me? Because he's a man and I'm a woman." And the particularity aspect then comes into focus. But of course, in the terms that Christian theology has tried from early days to articulate the meaning of the incarnation, the word, although in English we often have used the word became man, that of course in Greek is anthropos, not man, not maleness. And the attempt in that was to speak of the humanness of Jesus. But at the same time, we do have to take very, very seriously these particularities. Jesus was Jewish and not Gentile. Jesus was male and not female. And so how one handles these things, it's very challenging, I think. And one shouldn't try and solve that tension too quickly, I think. Indeed, if anything, we learn from Jesus and the way that he teaches is he rarely gives us a solution to things too quickly. He more often poses something back that keeps that kind of tension going so that we don't settle in what we think we've got right.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to address this, or can we move on to the next question? Okay, move on to the next question. Okay, lots of questions here, so obviously I will take the chair's privilege of picking out some, and I apologize for those who have not been asked. As there are a lot of activists in this room, practitioners, I think I'm tempted to go for this question here, and I will address it initially to Al. So what examples have you seen of facilitated church-led programs of dismantling whiteness into group work amongst white people? And none or nothing is a perfectly acceptable answer.
So I think a couple of answers from me. One, just really grateful to Paul for setting this in the broader historical context. and reminding us that actually we're not the first generation to have asked questions about anti-racism and to be working and struggling in solidarity. And I think the tendency is a certain forgetfulness about that history. So I think those reminders are really important. But equally, I have a sense that the past year, particularly since the murder of George Floyd, has led to a new energizing of that work amongst white people, or at least a new awareness of the urgency of that work. And so we have some good examples in one of our streams this afternoon of some of those programs that have been in operation. We have 3 examples there that are worth paying attention to. My sense is that there's also a fair bit of thrashing around looking for something, and a certain amount of tentativity, and not exactly knowing where to turn for the resources. And so I'm aware, for example, the Council for World Mission has been working through its Legacies of Slavery programme on beginning to accumulate some resources to be able to help local churches, but also wider institutional bodies to work on this stuff. I'm aware, certainly within the Church of England, that the Archbishop's Anti-Racism Task Force has been trawling back over 30 years worth of recommendations, most of which have not been implemented or taken seriously up until now, but with a sense of urgency that now is the moment to begin to act. So a lot of the stuff's there, particularly for those of us that have got longer memories. But again, I think paying attention to this moment and seeing what's emerging is also necessary.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Rachel, because I know that you wrote a piece in a racial justice program that was written by Marjorie Lewis and Sandra Ackroyd, and they're both mature a number of years ago. And I think for me, that was probably the first time I saw a white British person talking about whiteness. So perhaps if you could say a little bit about that, Rachel.
Yeah, I think again, something to be reflecting on for me a lot has been how a lot of my learning came from me going to Union Seminary in the States, and how that in itself was really, if I think back to it, an example of white privilege, in that I was encouraged to apply for a fellowship to go there. And I kind of reflect now back on who was and who wasn't encouraged to apply for that fellowship. And I think what was really formative for me, and what I've kind of tried to think about how it might be replicated in this country, is kind of a consistent group of people working with each other about whiteness. So both really carefully listening to Black, Asian and Brown colleagues and peers, and that was part of my learning. But the other part, of which I hear in various other white anti-racist activists who also went to Union at different times, was being invited to be part of a small, like a cell group, a study group that was, I mean, it sounds horrific, it's made up of white people, but doing kind of intentional reading each week, intentional reflecting, kind of a mutual accountability group, really. And I know, not to name names, but I know students that I think it's at Westcott at the moment, putting up on Twitter about a group of students reading Willie Jennings' After Whiteness text together as a group of white students, weekly reading it. And I think that's a really good example of what I know in myself was really transformative, a small group work that was kind of ongoing, and really kind of enabled a space where I could kind of properly name where I'd messed up and not ask Black and Brown colleagues to fix it, but have to do that work myself. So I think I think that there's something there, Anthony, about how I was able to do a bit of reflection more publicly because I'd had that kind of mutual support accountability group, and I wonder whether that's a model going forward. Although again, I hear how awful that sounds, kind of all white groups meeting. But yeah, so if that could be done well, and with attentiveness to resources coming from Black activists who are writing about whiteness too, and Sarah, whose name I can't remember, who's at Union at the moment, begins with A, and it's like Anazaski or something. She writes about the importance of white people listening to Black and brown people about whiteness, and not just about white people. And I think that's a really important point too. Thank you.
Yeah, that is Sarah Azaransky.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, to me, I think, in my experience, and I'd say my learning about these things was not really in church context. It was actually in becoming involved in concrete and specific political, with a small p, campaigns around racism, around its effects on individuals and families. For myself, particularly in relation to issues around migration, deportation, family unification. And actually, much of this took place outside the church, linking into the church. And many of these actions, I think, were not a learning within the church, but were a witness and a challenge to the churches, through which the churches perhaps learned something. And that's certainly how I stumbled around trying to learn about how the problems of the white ethnic majority affect me, and what I could or could not do, and on what basis I could attempt to do that, and what I might learn through engaging in a concrete struggle for justice in particular instances. Taking the risk to do that, that one might get it wrong. And yeah, so for me, that kind of learning, much more than in kind of groups, so to speak. And I think there's a lot to be said in the Christian church for also prophetic actions and symbolisms that go on that can have a learning effect more broadly. I think very often one can forget this. It can just seem like external, through some external body doing things that don't touch people. But again, when I look back and think, where did I get my understanding of colonialism and imperialism from? I didn't get it from my own experience, or from the experience of those people I was close to. I might have done if I lived in particular parts of the UK, but I didn't. The first time I ever seriously thought about it was when I heard about the World Council of Churches program to combat racism, and in particular its special fund, so-called, which gave money as an expression of Christian solidarity direct to liberation movements in Africa. Now, one might say, with historical hindsight, what happened in Zimbabwe when the money was given to the Patriotic Front, and it was also given to the ANC, and it was also given to SWAPO? Was that a mistake? It was a high stakes risk, but I believe that spoke powerfully both to many Black people who were struggling, and I believe it spoke, well, it certainly challenged me at that time, because through that action I started to ask questions. How can it be that churches will hand over money that makes the world go around, not to have control over it, but to give it to people who are struggling for liberation? And in the UK, and now it's 40 years on this year from the Toxteth uprisings, okay? And the British Council of Churches Community and Race Relations Unit 40 years ago had like its own version of the special fund, that not as an act of charity, but as solidarity, it worked with various groups, and it gave money to the Liverpool 8 Defence Committee, which at that time caused enormous ructions in the media environment and in the church. Was thought, what is this, handing this over? But it was an incredibly powerful act of prophetic witness. And I wonder, I think our church structures and our ecumenical structures, ecumenical movement suffers from ecumenical amnesia. And I wonder, would any of our present ecumenical instruments do an action like that today?
Yeah.
And I have to say, I'm not sure they would.
No. No, and just a very quick addendum. And I don't want to be overly harsh on my own church, but I preached at the 50th anniversary of in Notting Hill at a service to mark the foundation of the program to combat racism. And not one member of the leadership of the Methodist Church turned up for that service. Not one. I know that Jill wishes to speak. Jill.
Simply just to add to the conversation, really, that I think for myself, I've learned both outside the church and inside the church, both about racism and about how to try and be anti-racist. And I've been really influenced recently by Ibram Kendi's book, How to be Anti-Racist, because I think he's spot on that actually we're always one or the other. We're either racist or we're anti-racist, and it's not actually possible to be neutral. So for me, that's been a really helpful thing to kind of take on board, that whatever decision or action or thing I'm about to say, it needs to be specifically anti-racist. And there's been some questions earlier up in the chat about, if we're going to dismantle whiteness, do we have to dismantle the church as well? And I think that's a really real question, at least in relation to church as we know it. So I think there really does have to be serious looking at everything within the church. And my own research is focused on particular relationships between people, but there is so much that individuals can do, and which as I said at the beginning, I feel I've failed to do over the years. So I'm kind of recommitted to trying to make more of a difference in the conversations, in the relationships within the church, because I think there is a lot that we can do to be anti-racist, and I think that then provokes people, church outwards, to be more active. But hopefully our experience outside the church also challenge us to try and dismantle the things that are wrong with inside the church. So along with Rachel, I think there's a huge amount to be done in terms of listening, and it's lovely to have international visitors with us today. That would have not happened if we'd organised a one-off day in the UK. The international visitors who are with us today would not have been here. In the Methodist system, as a teenager in Birmingham, we got to know people from different ethnicities because of our circuit set up with a group of churches. It doesn't have to be people within your own church. And now, because of the internet, there are going to be many, many ways, I think, like this, that we can engage with people and actually listen to their lived experience and see how that challenges us then.
Thank you. I think that we have come to the end of this period, because we now have our lunch break. Firstly, to say thank you to Rachel and to Paul for two absolutely fantastic, stimulating keynote addresses that have really set the stage well for us. And I think actually like to remind us that although this is a new initiative in terms of a collective conversation, that does not mean that people who are racialized as white have not been have done many, many really challenging work. And certainly when I read Paul's pamphlet from 1984, what struck me was, why were not people listening at the time when it came out? So thank you for all the inputs thus far. We're going to have a 35-minute break. We'll come back at 1:05, and then Al will explain the streams and breakout rooms. It says that down here, Al.
When we get back.
Ready.
Indeed, yeah. And also, I think the final thing to say is clearly there is so much that we can talk and engage with in this day. And although it's a long day, we will not have enough time. And so I think it's probably worth thinking that this hopefully is the first of many steps. It's not a conclusive event in and of itself, like we're not going to dismantle whiteness in one day. As my great hero James Cone once said to me, said Anthony, said, white supremacy is not going to sue for peace anytime soon. So basically, this is an ongoing battle. But this is the first, hopefully, of many steps that we will take. So please go away, find some ways of refreshing yourself. Don't log out. I think just sort of switch off your camera and mute yourself, and we will see you at 1:05.